morning, coronavirus germs and ladies. I know I haven't done a podcast in a while. This one's going to be a little different than most of the podcasts I've done up until now, in that because I haven't done one for a while and because there are multiple things I want to talk about, I'm not going to try to put a time limit on it. I instead have a bullet point list of things I want to go through, and this may be, in fact, it's very likely to be, by my standards anyway, extraordinarily long. So grab an adult beverage, pop the top on it. Do not do it in your car. We're going to get to that. And sit back and enjoy, because there's some information here that I think that we ought to be talking about, and it's data that we're developing as time goes on. Okay, we're going to start with COVID. First part of this is going to be COVID. So if you're interested in COVID-related things, when I start talking about Floyd and the violence and the so-called Black Lives Matter and stuff like this, you can just shut it off. If you want to only hear that part, well, I can't tell you exactly where it is, because guess what? I haven't finished recording it yet. So, sorry, you get to listen to the COVID stuff, I guess, or you can kind of skip around. All right, let's talk about one of the lies that we knew in February that has been circulated. By the way, I got a screech email from a doctor who, we know community transmission happens with people who they're not symptomatic yet, but they will get symptomatic. Well, actually, we don't know that. We presume it, and the only way that you know is to sequence the virus in your alleged index case and in the downstreams. That's how you know scientifically. And you say, well, I don't need to do that because this person was allegedly asymptomatic at the time, later developed it, and then a couple of days later, all these other people who they had contact with developed it, and that means that one caused two. That's not true. You know it. If you're running that BS, then you need to take your so-called MD, wherever you got that sheepskin from. I'm sure you're probably displaying it on your office wall somewhere. You need to go find a useful paper shredder, one that actually functions, and either stick it in there or light it on fire. Because without viral sequencing, unless those people are hermits and they never have any contact with anybody else, you do not know that they were the index transmission, that's where it came from. Let me give you an example. What this person talked about was a group of people who went to play a game, and they were all in a vehicle. One of them gets it, and then the other people in the car get it sequentially, okay? And another person who went to play the same game but drove in their own car does not get it. Now, this looks fairly good, right? You've got a few days separation, 4 or 5 days, between the symptomology development in person number one and symptomology development in the other people. So that looks like a fairly clean piece of evidence that number one gave it to numbers 2, 3, and 4. It's not necessarily true. But wait, you say, how's that possible? Well, it's very possible. What if number one had it and was latent? Number 2, 3, and 4 were exposed by the person who took their money at the golf counter. And you say, but how about number 5, who didn't drive in the same car? Number 5's innately immune. He can't get it. And therefore, he was exposed during the round of golf, or during the round of whatever, or whatever game, or whatever event. But he can't get the virus. He doesn't have antibodies. He's cross-immune. And you say, well, what are the odds of all of this? Well, they're that it would split along transportation lines. Actually, the odds are relatively low, right? I mean, we're talking about, in this case, we're talking about 5 people. So, if it's 50-50, all right, odds are not all that high. But they're not win the lottery low. It's just that you have a hypothesis but not evidence. Evidence that is scientifically admissible would be obtained by virally sequencing the virus from the alleged downstream persons and the index case. And if you do that, you can now prove it. All right. But notice that we're not doing that in cases of alleged community transmission. We're not, with very few exceptions, we just aren't. And that's a problem. We have a study, we have 2 related studies out of Britain both of which are kind of interesting. One suggests that 50%, maybe as much as 60% of the population is innately immune to at least some degree from COVID. Now, this ties in with another study that I just was sent, and which, as it turns out, was published, I don't know, 3 weeks ago, thereabouts. I hadn't found it. I try to surveil all of these things, but boys and girls, I do not get them all, okay? I keep my nose down and I read as much of them as I can find. But I had an interesting conversation in a pub the other day about this because I was pointing out some of the BS that is in both CNN and Fox News in a conversation I was having with another patron that was there. And they said, well, how do you know this is BS? I said, because I go back to the source material that these people are allegedly using, and what's in the source material doesn't match what they're saying on air, and that's how I know they're lying. Now, I in some cases I can figure out what the truth is, in others I just know that whatever they're saying is not true. But the problem is that for the average person who actually has to go to work every day, instead of me who gets to sit around and play with myself for the most part, and do things that I'm interested in, one of which happens to be reading voraciously, and I'm very good at it, it's virtually impossible for you to look at any of the media or people like this email that I got, and you cannot take any of what is fed to you as being valid, because it probably isn't. And once in a while you'll find something in there that is valid. But the study out of across the pond says that 50% or thereabouts of people are not susceptible at all. Now there's another one, as I said, that I missed when it originally was published. Now, it has not been, neither of these have been peer-reviewed, folks. So they could turn out to be BS. I mean, this is one of the problems with the system we have today, is that we're publishing things that have not been reviewed yet. And pre-publication in the public is somewhat of a problem because it leads people to make bad decisions and to make bad calls for things that someone can intentionally or through stupidity believe that turns out not to be the case. We've had intentional misconduct in this regard. If you remember, we have 2 studies that were retracted after the data provider that fed them both refused to release the information and allow it to be audited. That looks intentional. But this particular one, we've got no evidence of that one yet. Okay, but what it says is that if you get a mild case of COVID or an asymptomatic case, you may not develop antibodies. Now, that's rather interesting. Or if you do, you develop them at a very low level, which are unlikely to be protective. Now, you got to be careful here, because that study is probably true. Okay, now it'll go through peer review. It's probably true, but it doesn't necessarily demonstrate what you think it demonstrates. And the reason is this: if you are asymptomatic, but you mount a robust immune response and you kill the virus in your body, you're going to develop antibodies, because antibodies are part of how that happens. Provoking an antibody response is how a vaccine works. Okay, you get the vaccine, it provokes an immune response, you have antibodies, and it is the antibodies that prevent you from having a clinical course of the disease later on. All right, so what does a weak or non-existent, or in this case, which was quite interesting, IgA antibodies were developed in the mucosal area, in the nose, but not at a serum level, at a clinically significant level. And the second level, IgG, show up at all. And you say, well, wait a minute. So that means that if you get a mild case, you don't develop antibodies. Well, okay. Or if you get an asymptomatic case, maybe you don't develop it. Okay. Why didn't I develop antibodies? It isn't because my body fought it off. It's because I was never susceptible in the first place, either partially or completely. And as a result, the other antibodies that produced the cross immunity are what stopped the infection. That is why my immune system didn't activate and produce a antigen specific to that infection. It didn't need to. It was never activated because the other one was there. Nobody wants to talk about that, because if you take that and you contemplate for a minute, and again, this this study has a submission or a publication date. The date that's on it is 5/21. If you take that, what you should have taken away from reading that some people don't develop an immune response, is not, oh my God, they could get it again, and the second time it could kill them. Oh, no. You're reading it wrong. What you should have taken from that is what the other British study suggests, which is that a very substantial percentage of the population has cross immunity. And if that substantial percentage of the population has cross immunity, what is that percentage? We don't know. And the reason we don't know is that this is very hard to measure. It's extremely hard to measure because we don't know precisely what antibodies provide cross protection. Can't test for what you can't define. The theorem is that these are from other common coronaviruses that cause colds and things like this. Okay? Be really nice to identify which one, because if I could give you a virus intentionally that caused nothing worse than a common cold, but it was protective against SARS-CoV-2, oh my God, we'd be doing that, wouldn't we? All right, let's have chickenpox parties. I think so. I'll go to a chickenpox party of that general sort. But then, then you start getting into the whole, did we make this up in terms of the severity of this thing? And you have to think about this in that context. And the reason you have to think about this in that context is that the modeling all assumes 100% susceptibility. We now know that's false. We knew it was false when Diamond Princess happened. And yet we continue to run this BS. We now have confirmation that it's false because in exactly nowhere was an actual logarithmic explosion of cases. Did it occur? Didn't occur anywhere. Didn't occur here. Didn't occur in any of the states. Not even in New York. And we'll get to New York because there's some interesting things with New York. Okay? But it didn't occur anywhere. And yet all of the models say that it absolutely should have occurred. This was the whole scaremongering. 2 million Americans are going to die. They're going to die now unless we shut down the economy. And it was all bullshit, folks. It was crap from the start. And the reason it was crap is that you had cross immunity within the population. Okay, if you take a 10% or a 5% fatality rate for people who end up with a clinically severe course of disease, in other words, one that's serious enough that they go see a doctor, and you among those people, 1 in 10 people that get it are clinically severe enough to go see a doctor, you now have 0.5% roughly of the people who get it die. And if you say that everybody in the United States is susceptible, everybody's going to get it until we get up to 60 or 70% immunity. Okay, now that's 60% of 330 million. So now we're in the 200-ish million people, and 0.5% of 200 million is a large number. It's 1 million dead bodies. Now that's basic arithmetic, and that's the scaremongering that was used. But what happens if that's not the case? What happens if the immunity level before you have herd suppression really it's in the same place as 66%. However, half the people aren't susceptible. And you plug that into your model and you find that you're already into suppression. So you get a ramp in case rates, but you never get the logarithmic explosion that's predicted. And that's exactly what we got. So exactly how long did it take for you to figure that one out? Well, again, when you're at the beginning of March, you start to see the climb. You can say, well, this kind of looks like it could go straight up vertical, right? But then, as I pointed out, by the end of March, the infection rate had bent downward. We hadn't locked anybody down yet. It takes 10 to 14 days before that shows up in clinical because it takes about 5 days for you to actually show the first symptoms and another 4 or 5 typically. Inside edge on that is probably 2. Outside edge is probably 10 before you go to the hospital. Pardon me, I have to drink my coffee while I'm doing this. And so because we had seen a downward bend, we knew at the end of March that the lockdowns were not doing it. We knew there was another factor. And the only factor that made any sense at all was that 100% of the population was not susceptible. And we didn't know why, but we knew that that was true, and we had scientific evidence to back it up because we had Diamond Princess. We had two people in multiple cases who were cooped up in the same room. One of them gets it, the other one does not. Now, remember, folks, this doesn't get clinically sick. This is doesn't get the bug. Repeated negative tests on a PCR. Okay, so on a repetitive basis, and by the way, PCR tests, they false all the time. However, the odds of repeated false results in the same direction are exactly the same as the odds of, if it was a 50% false rate, if I flip a coin, it's going to come up heads half the time, tails half the time. The odds of me having 10 tails in a row are infinitesimal. The 10th one is no more or less likely to be a head than any of the others. However, the odds of all of them coming up the same way in error, in the same direction, is infinitesimally small. So if you have a situation where people are being repetitively tested for a known condition, then there is that's how you control for the possibility of bad test results. So we had that happen with Diamond Princess, and we had people where one person in a cabin, again, if you've ever been in a cruise ship, folks, the inside cabins, they might be 100 square feet, including the bathroom. Okay, they're tiny. You're talking about married couples here who are sleeping in the same bed. And so one of them has a respiratory virus. You're telling how does the other one not get it unless they can't get it? Which is exactly what happened. And not only are they sleeping in the same bed, they're being forced to be confined in the same 10 by 10 foot space for weeks. Well, if you're susceptible, you're going to get that bug. Okay, that's just how it is. All right. So we have this cross immunity, but we don't know exactly what it is. But we refuse to run this down. And yet, it's very important. It's extraordinarily important. Because when you start talking about people who have been exposed, if they're not susceptible, who cares? Okay, secondly, from a standpoint of public health, this is the issue with a so-called novel virus. Because if the assumption is that there is no cross immunity and it's false, then everything else that you assume is wrong. And everything else you do is wrong. And there's no way to make it right. Okay, it's wrong, period. And that's it. All right, let's move on. I think I've beat that one into the ground. We now have some very bad things developing with regards to epidemiology and such, and that is the confounding factors. We're getting wildly different attack rates and seriousness of infection rates in different subpopulations. And we're being prohibited from going where the data leads with that. There was a doctor, I think it's a doctor in Tennessee, who was on loan outside the state somewhere else. And the discussion was taking place about why it is that black people seem to be disproportionately affected. And one of the arguments that the race baiters have made is that there's a problem with healthcare access, and this is why black people have more severe courses of disease. Folks, look, I don't know where people are coming up with that crap, okay? All I got to do is, given what we know about what tends to cause a more severe course of this disease, obesity, diabetes specifically, and then you take a look at the prevalence of those conditions among black Americans and white Americans, you will see a substantial difference. And that by itself is likely enough to account for the difference in severity. However, there's another conundrum that comes up, and that is that black people appear to be having a higher attack rate than whites. Now, that can't be related to existing healthcare status. Why would it be more likely that black people would be attacked by the virus than white people? Well, there could be a difference in cross immunity. It's possible. Some of that cross immunity may be genetic. There is some evidence that blood type O, for example, is naturally protective to some degree. We don't know to what degree, but there's some evidence that's there. I have not done any kind of research as to the prevalence of different blood types in different racial makeups. So I don't know whether or not there's potentially an explanation there or not. There might be. But what got the gentleman from, I think it was a gentleman anyway, from Tennessee, fired, removed from the discussion, was to suggest that black people don't wash their hands as often as white people. Well, folks, why is that racist? What if it's true? Remember, we had, from very early on, during the course of this disease, we had a hospital, I believe it was in South Korea, that had a huge problem with transmission between the practitioners in the hospital, the nurses and doctors in the hospital. And this was becoming a problem not just because they were giving it to the patients who came in without COVID, but because they were getting sick, and it's kind of hard for you to be an effective doctor or nurse if you're sick. That doesn't work so well. So they instituted mandatory anal-style hand washing procedures. When you came into the room, you had to wash your hands. When you left the room, you had to wash your hands. If you touched any surface in the room, you had to wash your hands. And they found that when they did this, the transmission rate between people within the facility went to an effective statistical 0. I reported on this at the time. Well, what does that tell me? That tells me this probably isn't respiratory transmitted. Then we found out that this virus shows up in poop. And we know factually it shows up in poop. There were very early reports, but then MIT actually found that they can essentially do a replacement for serology testing for prevalence and detect the incipient outbreak in neighborhoods. Now think about this. Incipient outbreaks by sampling sewage. Well, how in the hell does the virus get into sewage? Well, it comes out your butthole. Duh. Okay. So we now know, and again, we knew this very early on, February, March, that this virus was shed in feces. And yet, again, to talk about the fact that this virus is shed in feces means that we now have to have a very serious conversation about all sorts of other things going on with regards to how we're getting, we're actually transmitting this bug. And there's all kinds of problems with this. And one of the big ones is that exactly 0 of our hospitals, and especially our care homes, are set up to deal with this. A major confounding problem for those facilities is that they all use institutional-style high-pressure flush toilets, which spray material from the bowl all over the place. And if you put lids on those toilets, it doesn't do a bit of good because all it does is spray it on the lid. And now, in order to use the toilet, the next time you have to lift the lid, right? And then you have to put it back down. Well, guess what? Right. And so now any lapse there means that, listen, I'd rather have the virus on my shoe because I'm less likely to pick it up and put it in my mouth that way by accident than on something that I have to touch with my hands. And the other problem you have is that if you have a lid and you sit on the throne, if your back touches the lid, you've now contaminated either your back or your shirt. Okay, and the second is a huge problem because if you contaminate your shirt when you go take it off, you're almost certain to get it on your hands. And how many people, after they take off their clothes in the evening or the afternoon or whenever you change your shirt or whatever have you, how many people consider that to be a contaminated surface and immediately wash their hands? Well, no one. All right, and so this is one of the things that makes fecal-oral transmission so damnably difficult to stop. It's one of the reasons that polio had an R of 5, because it is primarily transmitted fecal-oral. And it's very, very hard to stop transmission of fecal-oral bugs. We know this. We know this from history. We know this from other bugs that have been transmitted this way. And in the context of a nursing home, we're virtually, huge, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's very high, folks. The folks are incontinent, and many of them are incontinent to a severe degree. we think about, if you're like most people, I typically am, when everything's going the way it's supposed to be, about once a day I go take a number 2, right? I number 1 all the time, but, because you drink, and if you stay well hydrated, you pee quite frequently. But number 2 is typically about a once a day, maybe twice a day kind of thing, right? Well, that's because you have a series of muscles. There's sphincters inside your butthole that keep what's in there from coming out whenever it just damn well feels like it. Okay, so it accumulates until there's enough there, and then you get the urge to go, and you go, and the first one opens, and you have the urge. The second one opens, and out it comes. And this is how that works. Okay, the problem is when those muscles don't work. And by the way, this is actually kind of important on another level too, because water resorption is important. Otherwise, you'd get severely dehydrated. This is one of the reasons that diarrhea is so damning and so dangerous, and that part of the process of digestion is that most of the water that is used gets reabsorbed by the body, which is why you have solid waste as opposed to really nasty running. I mean, stuff that comes out of your stomach, besides the fact that it's full of acid that has to be neutralized, is also extremely, it's a liquid, basically. It's very close to a liquid. And if you've ever barfed, there's your answer, right? So when you get to the other end, though, you don't. You have a nice little turd. Okay, or at least you hope you have a nice turd. The thing is that if you don't have functioning muscles down there because you're incontinent, the signaling's screwed up, or the muscles are screwed up, or whatever it is that's screwed up, you basically are at a low level crapping yourself every 15 minutes, half hour. It's extremely common. And therefore, you have to be changed all the time, which means somebody has to come in contact with it, which means that infection control becomes a real problem. And if you have COVID in feces, right, what are we going to do about that one? Yeah. All right. And by the way, nobody is still talking about this. No one. There is another study out of Britain that says that in Britain, 1 in 5 to 1 in 4 of the people who got COVID got it in the hospital. Now think about that. That number ought to be 0, and yet it's not. Oh, but healthcare workers, they're heroes. Yeah, they're spreading disease. They're getting people sick. You think that's not going on in nursing homes writ large? Yes, it is, ladies and gentlemen. Okay. So let's take the racism angle out of it, because you know what? But here's the thing. Firing people because they're putting forward hypotheses is a bunch of bull. How do we run things down unless we look at angles that people propose from deductive reasoning? And by the way, that's a reasonably decent hypothesis. It may turn out to be true. It may turn out to be false. But we've got some more information that we ought to load up into this thing. And that is, we've also had a lot of outbreaks in meatpacking plants, homeless people, prison populations, and Native Americans. Now, these are 4 subgroups. And guess what? They're not all black. In fact, there really isn't any correlation there, right? I mean, Native Americans, that's a genetic subgroup all their own. Prison populations are not, that's not a homogeneous population from a racial perspective at all. Homeless people tend to be white more often than otherwise. Not always, but it's the population of homeless people is, if you did a census, you'd find that more of them are white than anything else. And meatpacking plant workers, which are predominantly, but not exclusively, Hispanic. Central South American and Mexican. Mexican, I guess. Yeah. American, but not United States. Okay. What's the common element here? We're talking attack rate here, folks, right? Very high attack rates. The common element is they live in very dense population groups compared to the prevalence of toilets. Meatpacking plant workers often live in housing units that have large numbers of people packed into one small apartment. Prisons, of course, 2 to a cell, 1 toilet. And, oh, by the way, the cells are blocks and very close to each other. And while there is a sink, I wouldn't exactly call soap and water as a something that's fastidiously used, right? Probably not. Okay. How about homeless people? Where do they go to the toilet? Duh. Yeah, soap and water? What soap and water? And Native Americans on the reservations, especially out west, and we've seen, folks, you look at some of the data in some of the Arizona counties, it is stunning. The positivity percentage rates among the tests that have been run, it's truly scary. But, again, large numbers of people living in a housing unit, many of which do not have running water. Don't have flush toilets, and they don't have running water. Now, let's talk about the disparity in another way. The Native Americans are getting attacked not only from getting the virus, they're getting very seriously ill and they're dying from it. The prison population, the homeless people, and the meatpacking plant workers, well, I really ought to turn that around. In order of trouble, in other words, you get the bug and you get really seriously sick and you die, Native Americans, number one, in that area among the high attack rate groups. Next would be the meatpacking plant workers, although much lower. Most of the people in the meatpacking plants, nearly all who get it, have either a mild course of disease or they're asymptomatic. They don't get seriously sick and they don't die. Then you have the prison population, where we have seen repeated data dumps where somebody gets sick in a prison, they test everybody in the prison, and they report a whole crap ton of positives. In fact, this is the reason you've seen some spikes in some of the states, including Tennessee, because they went through and they tested a prison after somebody got a fever, and by God, they found that 1 in 3 of the inmates is positive for COVID, and yet they're not sick. They don't get sick and they don't die. And then the real nasty homeless people. We've had a couple of serology and PCR tests done in homeless shelters where we've seen positive rates of up to 80%, and yet essentially 0 of those people get clinically ill at a level distinguishable from the normal kinds of things that go on among the homeless population. Now, if you have dogs, we have this thing, they call it kennel cough, because it's very common for respiratory viruses to be passed between dogs in a kennel. And so we call it kennel cough. Well, you got the same kind of thing going among homeless people in shelters. Homeless cough. A huge percentage of the people in homeless shelters have some kind of cough. Right? It's endemic, and it has nothing to do with coronavirus. It's just all the other bugs that are going around. And yet these people seem to almost universally get the bug. Okay, in other words, they pop positive on a PCR test, and yet they don't get sick. All right. Folks, I have several hypotheses for what's possibly going on there. All of this correlates very well with fecal-oral transmission routes, every bit of it. It also correlates very well with obesity, diabetes, and the use of ACE and ARB modulating drugs. How many homeless people are taking pharmaceuticals for high blood pressure or diabetes? Any pharmaceutical. For anything. Almost 0, right? Essentially 0. They get the bug, but they don't get clinically sick and doesn't kill them. Okay? How about prison populations? Well, prison populations have some issues with BMI and some issues with, but how many of them are actually on these kinds of meds? I don't know, but it would be interesting, especially the ACE-ARB modulators, to see what percentage of the prison population is using those compared against the general population. Meatpacking plant workers, largely immigrants, largely with no access to organized health care. I bet you their use of those drugs is 0 or very close to it. And they're getting the bug, but very few of them are getting seriously ill. A few, but not very many. Native Americans are getting hammered. And what do we know about Native Americans? Well, we know that Native Americans have one of the highest obesity rates among all population subgroups in America. We also know they have one of the highest diabetes rates among all subgroups in America. And they have extraordinarily high rates of alcohol abuse. And they're getting pounded. Folks, if we don't ask these questions, is this a hand washing thing? Is that where the attack rate's coming from? Quite possibly. All right. If you were to spend your time being absolutely ridiculous about hand washing, let's say that instead of talking about masks, okay, instead of that, we were to place near the entrance of every public accommodation, restaurant, hotel, whatever, a portable device that plugged into the wall, and the wall power was there to provide the energy to heat water to a comfortable temperature, and it had a large tank of water in it. You filled that tank of water up with a garden hose, and it dispensed soap, non-contact, right, and water. You put your hands under it, it flows water. You put your hand under the thing, it flows soap, much like you have in some commercial bathrooms, right? And every single person washed their hands before they came into that building. And that was the protocol. Not masks, not gloves, none of that BS. That was what you did before you came in. What would that do to infection rates? What if we put that in front of every doctor's office, in front of every hospital, in front of every ER door, in front of every single one of these places? Okay, now this would not be expensive. Would we solve the problem of transmission? We might. And you know why we might? Because we have data out of South Korea that says that essentially stopped the transmission in a hospital when you had known index cases that were symptomatic. And yet that stopped transmission to those people. But no, it's racist to suggest that the reason that black people are getting infected at a higher rate might be because they don't wash their hands as often as whites. What if it's true? And why don't we take these? Hey, would it really be that hard to put these kinds of things in? No, it wouldn't. You're telling me that the average business doesn't have an electrical outlet near the door somewhere? You're telling me it would be very hard? I mean, hard plumbing this kind of a thing in could be difficult. You don't need to hard plumb it in. Fill up the tank with a water hose. How tough is this? It's not. What if we did that? Would that actually, and oh, by the way, how much of a difference would that make during flu season? Think about that. It would make an enormous difference during flu season. And where do we make a big deal out of this? We do when it comes to, you've got signage up. If you work here, after you use the bathroom, you got to wash your hands with soap and water. Well, guess what? That's smart. How many people actually do it? I don't know. All of them? I'm willing to bet not. But you know what? The average person, they've done surveys on this, folks, and a huge percentage of people, when they go into a public bathroom, they don't wash their hands. Okay? Now, for a guy, if you're doing number one, yeah, okay, I can see, But if you're taking a crap, different story. Okay? Because fecal-oral transmission is a thing. Not just for this bug, but for others. And oh, by the way, in the context of food sanitation, it's really important because, there's these things, there's some really nasty stuff that gets transmitted that way. We knew early on that this was a way to control the spread of this bug. And we spent zero attention on this in the context of public health and public facilities. And it is cheap. But no, we can't do that. We can't have a nice little water, wash your hands station out in front of the door. Even though it would not be hard to do, the power requirements would be relatively modest because you only need to heat up enough water for each person as they go through. And it doesn't have to be hot water, it just has to be warm. So it's comfortable. Warm water and soap. Soap! It's not complicated, folks. It really isn't. Okay. Now, let's talk about this racial thing. Floyd to start with. Anybody that still believes that there is not some connection between these two people, the deceased and the attacker, is out of their mind. Anyone that thinks that this is primarily a racial issue is, again, crazy. Okay? Just crazy. And I pointed out right after this thing happened with Floyd, how about the girl, the Australian in Minneapolis, who was shot and killed when she attempted to solicit police assistance? Was shot and killed by a Somali, a Somali American, who was on the force, who fired across the body of his partner. There was no boogaloo. There was no violence. There was no looting. There was no burning. And by the way, what does looting have to do with protesting racial injustice? People grinning ear to ear with a pair of Nikes or a flat screen TV in their hand. Oh, yeah, they're protesting, all right. Like hell. That's flat out animalistic behavior. And anyone that says it's not is nuts. The crazed nonsense that's going on. More set-asides. You know, we haven't had enough set-asides. Can we talk about the difference in SAT and ACT scores for black people versus white people to get into college? Can we talk about the fact that we spend in some states $20,000 a pupil per year attempting to educate people who don't want to learn? Can we talk about the fact that we have to put armed police officers into schools in Chicago in order to keep them from turning into gangland shooting matches? You want to defund the police? Really? Well, you go right ahead and do that. I am not going to go into a place where there is, it looks like something out of Somalia or Beirut, and I'm either going to get shaken down or just flat out shot because somebody wants to steal my car. Why would I go into such a place? Why, by the way, would a trucker go into such a place? Oh, yeah, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Seattle. Yeah, oh, boy, we're so prosperous. Why? Within hours of taking over, homeless people stole all the food. But there's no police. We can't arrest anybody for stealing all the food. Well, wait a minute. The response to that wasn't, let's have some police? Well, theft is not wrong. Oh, no. We want people to donate vegan supplies and guns. Because, wait a minute. What do you need guns for? Could you explain to me why you need guns if you're not willing to use them to defend your food supply? What's wrong with this picture? And then the latest is, well, if you're white, and by the way, as a white speaker saying this, you have to donate $10 to a black person. If you're white. And it's a donation. Well, I don't think anybody did. So how are you going to enforce this? If it's a donation, it's not going to happen. So what's next? Is it going to be a tax? Oh, I thought you just got done telling me that you weren't going to have any cops. Well, how would you enforce the payment of a tax other than with a gun, ultimately? And speaking of which, there are rumors that they're shaking down merchants and local residents for quote-unquote donations. And guess what they're doing them with? Give it to us, we'll shoot you, or we'll burn your building. Okay. That sounds like Somalia, Beirut stuff again. This is going to work out real well. There are people calling for Donald Trump to send the military in. No. And no is the correct response to that. And anybody who says that he should is out of their mind. The governor, Mr. Inslee, has not asked for that intervention. And you say, well, but the Constitution says that the federal government will guarantee a Republican form of government to the states. Well, it does. However, the state government has every ability to deal with this. If it refuses, then at the point that the federal government was to take such an action as to declare that state in revolt, and therefore essentially to have attempted to secede, the action is not to take back Seattle. The action is to remove from the representation that Washington has in the federal government the state from that representation. And I remind you that both the House and the Senate, by a vote of their membership, can expel any of their members. They have the ability to do that. And therefore, that would be something that would be an appropriate act. If you want to go further than that, if you want to declare that an actual war has taken place, remember, folks, the president's power to unilaterally wage military action rests upon a prompt response being necessary because of hot pursuit. In other words, if a bomber comes over the horizon and is apparently going to blow up New York City, the president does not have to go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war in order to have it shot down, because by the time that Congress could do that, the bomb would have dropped and New York City would be incinerated. Therefore, the president is fully within his duties as commander-in-chief to blow that aircraft out of the sky. But that's not the case here. That this organization, this loose organization of people, much like Occupy Wall Street, has essentially taken over this area is not something that has, I mean, there's no hot pursuit. These people aren't going anywhere. In fact, they're making quite clear they have no intention of going anywhere at all. So we have process through which this needs to be handled. And frankly, we should find out whether or not federalism still exists, because federalism mandates exactly that sort of process. Congress, on the other hand, has every right to come back into session and say, look, Governor Insell, you and the state legislature, your state police, whatever have you, this is a taking. And if you're going to allow a taking from your residents under the Constitution of the United States, you must pay them for the value confiscated. And you must do it now. Because under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, that's what's required. Now, you can take for public purpose. And so if the government of Seattle, the government of Washington State, decides that this is what they want to allow to happen, then they can do that. However, they must take the diminution of value and pay it to the people who had it diminuted. And where are they going to get the money from? Well, they're going to have to tax it from everybody else, right? I mean, at the end of the day, folks, this is the same thing we got going on with all these other places. Okay, all these people, we should lock down because of COVID. And you know what? Not one of those state governments, not one, weighed the costs, figured out how they were going to pay for it, and said the potential public health benefit, maybe, had this cost. This was what we were going to have to do, and had that debate. And you had the time to have it, too. You had a month in March. But that debate never took place. No. They just took the actions. And if they'd had that debate, would the outcome have been different? I think it would have, because an awful lot of people would have said, no, screw you, I'll take my chances. No, screw you. You're not going to shove people in nursing homes that are COVID positive. Yeah. By the way, take New York's death stats out of there, reduce them to a ratable percentage of the population. Tell me whether or not you're still all that scared of those numbers, because that big spike becomes not so big. In fact, it looks like a whole lot like 2018's flu spike, if you take New York out of there. So you got this autonomous, which, by the way, looks an awful lot like Occupy Wall Street. Who remembers that? I did some reporting on that. I actually went over into Pensacola where they had a zone where they had set up there in a public park in the middle of downtown Pensacola. They took over a park, and they were going to change the world, and they wanted to defund the police, and we had racism and this and that and the other thing. I went over there with a microphone, and I talked to people. because I was very, very genuinely curious as to exactly what they were trying to accomplish and what they thought they were going to do. And what I found was a bunch of people who essentially were out there to camp and party and have a good time and maybe smoke some weed, even though weed's illegal in the state of Florida. Was at the time, still is. And really didn't have any cogent idea of how they were going to get anything. But, hey, this looked really good. And it got co-opted immediately. I actually got the microphone and got to speak for a little while. I had a megaphone that they passed around. You get to stand up on literally a soapbox. Okay. And, and I got my turn. You had to wait your turn. But I got my turn, and I asked some of these questions. And there's a lot of silence. I don't remember if I still got the video laying around from it. I'm going to have to go dig through my archives. I might, because I did record it. I don't keep everything I ever do. But most. I have to dig around on my network server and see if I can find those files. It might be interesting to repost them because I remember very well the conversations I had with the people. And I was mic'd up, and very obviously so. I was carrying around a studio-style microphone in my hand. I wasn't covertly trying to play with anybody. I was over there as acting as a reporter, and I found it fascinating. But this Chaz thing is the same sort of thing. And then but you do have some governors who are saying absolutely not, no effing way. Governor Lee here in Tennessee has said you're not pulling that crap in Nashville. No, this is what federalism is. Folks, this is federalism. States that make good decisions succeed. States that make poor decisions fail. That's how it's supposed to work. And anyone that thinks that this whole thing with Floyd and the cops is really a racism issue, you have rocks in your head. It's a police brutality issue. Police, a large percentage, not all by any stretch of the imagination, but a very significant percentage of cops are just flat out brutes. And some of the blame is ours. All right. Look, you can't change the facts as reported by the FBI that if you're a black man, you are many times more likely to commit murder than a white man. And yet, black people are 18% of the population, something like that. So why is it that Black Lives Matter? Well, Black Lives Matter. By the way, if they really matter, why don't you look at Hey Jackass? Because most of the time, what do those black men shoot? Other black men. So if Black Lives Matter, I would think that the most important thing in terms of actually changing the outcome would be to find ways to not have black people shoot other black people. Because most of the time when black people shoot someone, they shoot another black person. And last time I checked, if you get shot, whether you're white or black, and you die, you're dead. And therefore, if the goal is that Black Lives Matter, then you need to dispassionately analyze who shoots black people. And most of the time, who shoots black people is other black people. That's what the statistics tell us from the DOJ and the FBI and Hey Jackass and everybody else that has looked at it. But you can't say that because that's racist. Well, wait a minute. Are you interested in solving problems, or are you a race baiter and a screamer? What is the truth behind all of this? Well, I'm going to close talking about this thing in Atlanta. So this was a last night deal. Actually, I guess 2 nights ago? Last night? Okay. Guy is... Now, this is curious because the original reporting was that there was a guy sleeping in the drive-through lane at a Wendy's, sleeping in his car. The people were having to pull around him. He appeared to be passed out. And so eventually the business calls the police and says, hey, we got a guy. I mean, hey, who knows? Maybe there's medical distress here, all right? I mean, it does happen, all right? I mean, the most likely explanation is he's stoned, but, we're not really sure, right? So anyway, cops show up. He fails a field sobriety test. This is the official narrative. He fails a field sobriety test, gets in a fight with the 2 cops, manages to break free from both of them while they're trying to arrest him, runs off, and they shoot him in the back. Now, this is the narrative, right? Okay. So the original video, shot by bystanders, does not show him being shot. However, it does show the fight. He does kick the cop's ass. And then he runs out of the frame, and then you hear bang, 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 okay? And he dies. Okay. Last night, the Wendy's where this occurred apparently was burned. And freeways were blocked in Atlanta and all kinds of, nasty fun stuff. All right. I've now looked at several different sets of video, including body cam video from one of the officers that was involved in this. The chief of police in Atlanta has stepped down over this and has said that while this may have been legitimate use of force, it was, in their opinion, excessive, and they take responsibility, so they stepped down. One of the two officers has been fired. All right. So let's go back to first principles here. The video from the officer's body camera does not appear to show the vehicle in question blocking a traffic lane. And secondly, the vehicle was on private property. It does show the original interaction with the officer where they suspect he's been drinking. They ask him. He says he's had a couple of margaritas. They produce a portable breathalyzer, which very similar to the one that I keep in my car so that I don't drive drunk accidentally. And on the body cam video, you can see that it shows that he blew a 10, a .10, all right, which is over the 0.8 legal limit. All right. And then subsequent to that, there is a fight, physical fist fight type of fight. These two cops manage to take this guy to the ground. He breaks free from them and runs. And in the process of this fight, he gets one of their tasers, one of the police officers' tasers. They were attempting to tase him, so they drew it. He wrestled it free. And then he runs, and the other angle from the security footage shows him while running, putting his arm behind him, churning, while continuing to run away, has this thing in his hand the entire time, and that is the point at which they shoot him. Now, I've got a bunch of questions about that. Number one, tasers only fire one shot. If the taser had been discharged, then the police officer knew that because he never concealed this thing, it was in his hand the entire time, and he's running, okay, so his hands are where you can see him. The cop who shot him, police officers who fired, knew that what he had in his hand was an inert device. Now, police officers have many times been faced with somebody holding something that turns out to be a cell phone. It's dark. It looks like a gun. They shoot the person. They think it's a gun. And they're exonerated, ultimately, because somebody pointed something at them that could have been a lethal weapon. Okay. If you point something at me that I reasonably can believe is a lethal weapon, I am probably going to be in the clear if I shoot you in response to that. Because by the time that I know that it is a lethal weapon, in other words, after you fire it, I'm already dead. So I don't have to wait to be dead in order to shoot back. Right? At the point that the threat is credible to use lethal force against me, I'm empowered to stop you. That's true whether I'm a civilian or a police officer. The question becomes, did these cops know factually that not only that he had a taser and not a firearm, but that it had been discharged? It was inert. In other words, he didn't hold anything. Now, he didn't know that a taser is a one-shot weapon, or he wouldn't have turned and tried to use it. But the cops knew. Cops know what they're carrying. They know that once you shoot a taser, it doesn't work a second time because you have to change a cartridge in it. So, did the police officers who fired know that that was what was in his hand? And the evidence that I've seen thus far strongly suggests the answer is yes. All right. That's a problem. Now let's take it to a different level. Why did the incident occur in the first place? The footage I have seen thus far does not suggest that the vehicle was blocking traffic. It also, the narrative given to the police officers by the suspect, as from their own body camera footage, says that he was dropped off after consuming alcohol by his girlfriend. Therefore, he didn't operate the vehicle on a public street while intoxicated. All right, now that is what he told the cops. I don't know if that's the truth or not, but the cops were attempting to get him to admit to the elements of an offense for which they could arrest him for something other than public intoxication. In other words, DUI, a reason to actually take him into custody and take him downtown. Up until the point that the police produced the breathalyzer, which he begrudgingly agreed to, he was probably under the belief that what he had done was not an arrestable offense. I happen to know differently, which is why if I am going to get in a parking lot in my car and sleep off or rest off, having had potentially too much to drink, I make sure that I don't have the keys. Because in Florida, where I used to live, I assume in Tennessee, although I haven't done the exact research on it, in most other places, if you are capable of operating a motor vehicle, even if you don't operate it and you're intoxicated and you're in a position to operate it, you can be charged with DUI, constructive DUI, even though you never actually drove on a public street. That's a problem, folks. But the problem isn't racial. The problem is that the law's fucked up. We won't take on the real cause of these problems. If the law was rational, this man, being in a private parking lot while intoxicated, upon his own property, his vehicle, there's no evidence the car was stolen, no evidence he didn't have a right to be in the car, okay? The absolute worst thing that could happen would be that he could be given a trespass by the private property owner, specifically the restaurant, and told to leave. Now, if he's intoxicated, he gets in the car and he leaves the parking lot. Now you can arrest him. But let's say that that's not what happens. They call the police and they give him a trespass, and they say, well, you know, we think you might be intoxicated. They give him a breathalyzer, and he blows a 10. And then the rational thing to do is for the officer to warn him, sir, you must leave the property, but you are too intoxicated to drive. If at that point he then attempts to drive, throw him in jail. But what if he instead pulls out his cell phone and either gets a hold of his girlfriend or he summons an Uber or a taxi and has him take him to somewhere else and leaves the car in a parking lot? Now, if the business owner wants to be a complete prick, he could conceivably have the guy's car towed, which would cost him a couple $100 to get back. But he's not going to jail. He's not getting a DUI. There's no altercation. There's no fight. And he doesn't die. Folks, nobody wants to take on the real root of the problem here, which is that we have written laws in every state of the union, including the one I live in now, and including in Florida, that make this kind of behavior by the police not only considered acceptable because, boy, oh boy, you violated the law, but provide justification for escalations like this and provoke those escalations. What law are you breaking if you park your vehicle, get out, get into another vehicle, go somewhere or walk, get smashed, and come back? At that point, what law have you broken? If you get in your car and operate the vehicle on a public street, okay, we have decided that operating a vehicle on a public street with a blood alcohol content in excess of 0.08 is unreasonably dangerous, and therefore we can arrest you for that and give you a DUI, and you get to spend the night in jail and go see the judge and ignition interlocks and blah, 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 blah. Okay, fine. The public has, through its public process, come up with that's what we say that it is. I can argue whether or not that's the right place to put the line. It doesn't really make any difference. The fact of the matter is that we did that through a democratic process in a Republican government, and that's okay. And we can fix it that way too. But notice what we did instead. Being intoxicated in a public place is potentially a charge of public intoxication, but it's not DUI. Public intoxication is typically a ticket. Instead, we have considered not actually operating the vehicle to be a DUI. You never started the car. You never drove it on a public street. If he moved the vehicle, he moved it entirely within a private parking lot. It's not public space. It's not a public road. And yet we've extended the jurisdiction of law enforcement to claim that you committed driving under the influence on private property. That's why this man's dead. It has nothing to do with him being black. If you want to actually go after the problem, you have to look at where these predicates come from. Why is it that we have brutish behavior by police officers? Because brutish behavior by police officers is protected by qualified immunity. Why did these two police officers test this man for intoxication? Why did they run the line of questioning that they did on him? Because they were attempting to get him to admit to a criminal offense for which they could arrest him, and he did not admit to an offense against the public peace. Specifically, operating a motor vehicle on a public street while intoxicated. He didn't do that. The evidence in the video does not support that he did that. However, he was in constructive possession of the keys. He was in constructive possession of the ability to operate the vehicle, and by chemical test, he was intoxicated. And that by itself constitutes an offense under most states' laws. Folks, realize that in the state of Florida, and I don't know if it's true in Tennessee or other places, but it's true in Florida because I actually looked it up in Florida code. You can get a DUI on a bicycle. On a bicycle. No, you're not publicly intoxicated. You can actually have a DUI charged against your driver license, even though you don't have to have a driver license to operate a bicycle. But you can have a DUI charged against your driver license for being intoxicated on a bicycle. If you're walking, they can only get you for public intoxication. Why aren't we looking at the real cause of these kinds of situations? Why aren't we looking at the root of these things? Where did the offense come from for this individual in the first place? I mean, I don't know whether, listen, folks, maybe he was lying to the cops. Maybe he drove when he was drunk. He got in the drive-through lane, okay, and he wanted some food, and he passed out and fell asleep. Maybe. Or maybe it went down exactly as he told the cops it went down. That he had drinks with his honey, and he wasn't driving. Maybe. I don't know. Listen, I don't know. But what I do know is that we extended a statute reasonably designed to protect public health into a purely baited trap. And then we had two police officers who engaged in a line of questioning and a line of inquiry that attempted to come up with an excuse to arrest him for something that on its face, on the facial evidence, okay? Remember, this is not the cop sees you weaving in the road and turns the lights on and you pull into the Wendy's. I mean, that's not what happened here, folks. Nobody witnessed this individual, police officer or otherwise, operating a vehicle on a public road while apparently intoxicated. What started this entire thing was that he was sleeping in his car. So I don't know, but and look, when it comes to shooting him, as far as I'm concerned, the only reasonable question is, did the officers know that he had a discharged taser in his hand that was incapable of harming them? Because if so, they had no justification to fire on him. Under long-standing precedent at the Supreme Court, you cannot shoot even a fleeing felon, which at the point that he assaulted the officers, he probably got there. okay, and he did commit assault against the officers, but you still can't shoot him, was pointing a discharged taser in a haphazard manner while running. Did that give them cover to fire on him? If they knew it was a discharged taser, absolutely, that's an unauthorized use of force. By any rational standard, I don't care what's written in some police manual. I'm telling you under common law and under basic human decency how that should be read. But we are not going to stop this kind of brutish behavior by simply saying you can't shoot at the guy. The way we do that is by looking at what enables the brutish behavior in the first place. Here is a man who, at worst, his crime was that he was intoxicated in public. That's the evidence of what I saw in terms of actual criminal activity. And they were going to cuff and stuff him for being intoxicated in public. But what they were going to actually cuff and stuff him for was a much more serious charge, because they found a way in the existing code, and granted the code is written that way, to nail him for something that on the face of the evidence he didn't do. Does that have anything to do with being black? Not a bit. But are you, I, and everybody else, are we going to go after the real root of these problems? You know damn well we're not. You want to know why I don't bother doing podcasts and writing, as nearly as prolifically as I used to? This is why. This is why, folks. Because, by God, we're going to burn a damn town down. But we're not. We're going to burn it down because the guy that got shot was a black man. It doesn't have anything to do with him being a black man. It has to do with us having a set of police rules and a set of laws that make absolutely no damn sense, and they're simply used as a way to turn people into criminals because we don't have enough. It's not enough to take our police resources and actually focus on things like, I don't know, how about black people shooting black people in Chicago? There you go. Have a good day, folks.